All right, so I decided to do my presentation on this journal article that hopefully you guys had the chance to read beforehand about how maternal high-fat diets impact the microbiome of infants, and specifically the microbiomes found in the infant's gut. So for the longest time, scientists believed that for the most part, the placenta as well as the amniotic fluid was pretty sterile, and there wasn't a lot of microbiota within that environment. So they were really curious on how exactly we as a human species start to develop this microbiome in our gut as well as on the surface of our body. And the same people who conducted this study actually did the exact same study in primates and found that high-fat diets in mothers do impact the microbiota of infants. And not only at birth, but also they figured out after a year they still had impacts from that high-fat diet that the mothers were on. So once they found those results, they were curious on knowing if the same thing happened in humans. So this study deals with that specifically. In order to do this study, they ended up finding two groups of 80 females in their third trimester. And they separated these two groups into high-fat diets and then normal or control high-fat fat intake diets. And how they separated them was the high-fat diets were the group that classified of having 43.1% fat intake, whereas the control group, or the normal group, had a fat intake of 24.4 fat intake. And you may ask how they got this data and how they were able to distinguish how much fat intake each of these groups had. And what they used was they used just a simple questionnaire that's 26 questions long that was put together by the Dietary Screening Questionnaire Development. That's what the survey is called, is the Dietary Screening Questionnaire, and it's put together by the National Examination Survey Program. So each of them, before starting the study, their fat intake was determined, and then they're separated into these two groups. And this was all in their third trimester, and then they signed all the consent forms and said that it was okay if they did all this microbiome testing on them. So as soon as the baby was born is when they started taking samples. And they took samples of the newborn baby on the skin, in their mouth, and their nose, as well as a feces sample. And in order to conduct which microbiomes or microorganisms were present on each of these areas of the body, they just did simple 16S gene sequencing to determine that. And they also did the same type of sampling on the mothers at the same time, so right at birth. And then after determining which ones were present and which ones weren't present, they just waited until 4 to 6 weeks later. And then they went back to these same mothers and newborns, and they took the same samples. So on the skin, in the mouth, in the nose, and then also their feces. And they're most interested in the gut microbiome, but the reason why they took samples of the nose and the mouth and all these other places in the skin was to determine what the microbiome looked like within the mother's amniotic fluid, to see if they got these microorganisms through either swallowing the amniotic fluid at birth or any other relation there, just because they're trying to decide on how exactly these infants are developing these microbiomes. Anyway, so once they separated them to the two groups and they tested them 6 weeks later, they found some pretty interesting things. And the biggest thing that they found was in the mothers that classified as high-fat diets, so that 43.1% fat intake group, their infants actually showed lower amounts of bacteroids in their feces. And bacteroids from what I understand about them, they're commensal bacteria. So it's kind of like opportunist bacteria that we learned in class that's on our skin that just kind of sit there. They're not doing anything bad. If they're given a chance, then they might become pathogens. But for the most part, they are benefiting from us. We're not necessarily getting harmed by them, but they're actually, just by their presence, they're protecting us from other pathogens. So from what I understand, it's pretty similar with commensal bacteria, and that's what these bacterioids are, but in the gut of us as well as infants. So it was pretty significant that they found that these bacterioids were decreased in these high-fat diets, these maternal high-fat diets. And the reason why is because they made all these different speculations from other studies to kind of determine how that might impact the infant later on in its life. And right now they're thinking that it might be part of the reason why obesity kind of runs in the family, is because these high-fat diet mothers decrease the bacterioids in these infants, and then these infants aren't able to break down polysaccharides well enough to get enough energy for their bodies. And then also because of that, there's more chances of different diseases that come into play because these commensal bacteria aren't as high in concentration as they are in the normal or control group. So it's super interesting that they found that in there. That was the main one that they talked about, was the bacterioids. But there's a few other ones that kind of varied between the two groups, so it wasn't as easy to say that it was impacted by the high-fat diets necessarily. But with that, I talked about before how in their non-humans, their primate study, they went back and they tested the infants a year later. And they realized that the same thing, that the bacterioids were still decreased. They're still reduced even after a year. In this study, they didn't have the chance to do it that far out. They just did it 4 to 6 weeks after birth to see if the microbiomes in the stomach were still impacted. And they found that it was still impacted in the sense that their microbiota hadn't, bacterioids, hadn't increased from the time of birth. So, I mean, they could go back and do some other studies to see how long that has an impact, but for the most part, after 4 to 6 weeks, it is still impacted. And one of the reasons they came to this, or one of the reasons they did this study too, was to spread awareness to these mothers that in taking a lot of fats during the third trimester specifically, as well as during lactation after birth, will impact not only you as a person, but also your infant, in the sense that they're not going to have the correct microbiome to help the infant function successfully throughout its life. I think that was basically it for their study. I'm just checking over to see if there's anything else I missed. I don't think there was. So if there is any questions, you can post them below, and hopefully I get a chance to see those and respond to them in time. But if you didn't have a chance to read this study in depth, I highly encourage it, just because there is a lot of interesting things that they talked about specifically in their discussion about the correlations that these bacterioids could have later on in the child's life based on other studies that have been done. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and especially the article, and I look forward to your questions.